in your city, but here in Loraine, and I will warn you that my internet's been cutting in and out because we're getting our storms right now. And so I was just kind of praying before this, and I have to admit, I offered a prayer of thanksgiving that we weren't at Malone at CYF right now, because I remember the one day last year that we all had to walk down to the worship space when it was just like a mud pit and it was anyways. So I'm glad that God provided this place for us to meet virtually today. So I just want to do some morning check-ins for people that we didn't see yesterday and kind of see how everyone's doing and what you've been up to in quarantine. And then I'm going to introduce my friend Will, and we'll engage in conversation today. So who was not, Connor, you weren't with us yesterday. You want to tell us how you are and 30-second snippet of what's been going on in your quarantine?
I'm pretty good. The most interesting thing for us was our wedding was planned during this time. We had to do a lot of big changes to that. But we're getting through that now, and doing all my classes and my fiance doing all her classes online has also been a huge, huge adjustment for us while we're both in our master's work. So, but I mean, church is going good. We're getting all the live streaming and stuff just now figured out after all this time. And thanks to the help from the Burkharts to get us figured out on that one. But yeah, getting it all through.
Cool. Megan, how about you?
Well, it's been eventful. I haven't really done a whole lot. I started cheer practice not that long ago. And so I've just been working with them, trying to figure out what to do for this season. That's been kind of confusing, but I think it'll all work out in the end.
Have they given you any indication yet of if there will be a season?
So far we're just kind of carrying it on. Like, football practices have been going on, like lifting and stuff for them. So we've been working on a lot of stuff. So I'd assume we'd have one.
Okay. Matt.
Hello.
How are things with you? What have you been up to in quarantine?
It's been pretty all right. I've just been staying inside. Really haven't gone out. This week's been long because I just got my wisdom teeth out.
Ugh.
It's awful. But I'm feeling better now, so I'm okay.
Good. And anybody who was with us yesterday have any extreme life updates in the last 24 hours that they'd like to share? Come on, nothing? All right. Okay. Well, we ended. Yes. Owen, are you like in a professional recording studio, or like what is that setup?
Well, actually, I'm at work at the radio station at Mount right now. So this is just my mic from on air. But don't worry, we're not on air. At least on here.
We are streaming to YouTube live. So hello to all of our friends and fans that I'm sure are tuning in on YouTube. And hello to my alma mater, Mount Union. That's pretty cool. I was the last class to graduate from Mount Union College because I'm old. All right. So we ended yesterday's conversation. We were talking about kind of the two pandemics, and after Derek Trout's message on Sunday night, we spent yesterday talking about kind of our life in exile and what this quarantine has been like, and perhaps comparing ourselves a little bit to the Israelites and their complaining and their idol making. And anyways, we kind of started to bridge the conversation into what we're going to be talking about today, which we cannot ignore. Especially as people of faith, we cannot ignore what's happening in our nation and around the world. And so today I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about the pandemic of racism and what's been going on in your communities and what you're thinking and feeling and praying and working on. And I want to introduce my friend Will, who is down on the bottom of my screen. And Will, if you want to kind of tell about your work and just to give people some background, and then we'll open this up. And I just want to hear some comments and conversation from you guys first to hear, where you are on this. So go ahead, Will, and then we'll open it up.
That's a can of worms, I think, to say the least. All the things that I get to do. So I'm Will Jones. I'm the Director of Multicultural Vitality for the East Ohio Conference of the United Methodist Church. So I work out of our office of, sorry, the baby's crying in the background. So totally threw off my train of thought there. He's going down for a nap. That's how my quarantine's been going. But
he needs to be on camera, I think, is
Yeah.
what he's asking for, so we can all see him. Okay.
Yeah. But we have a conference council on ministries. It's part of our structure in the United Methodist Church that exists really to resource local churches and congregations so that they can better do ministry. So we all have kind of our specific areas of emphasis. Kay Wolfinger does young people and young adult ministry. Gary Jones does our camping ministry. So, CYF's a camp. We also have our 3 physical camps, Wanakee, Asbury, and what's the third one? That totally slipped my mind.
Aldersgate.
Aldersgate, thank you. I knew it was another A one, and they have camps at Lakeside and stuff too. So my specific area of resource is kind of racial and social justice. So in our United Methodist Church structure, we have the Commission on Religion and Race, which is a commission, a general church agency. It's at the global level. It came out of the very first General Conference of the United Methodist Church when the United Methodist Church became desegregated. So, immediately as the United Methodist Church from its inception in 1968 became desegregated, there was a recognition that we are going to have conversations about religion and race and how these two things intersect. And so that still exists today. And they exist to help us to have vital conversations. They help us to increase our intercultural competency and to see how we can do ministry in an increasingly cross-racial and cross-cultural world. So I, that exists at the general church level, and I get to help resource that at the conference level. And then we also have similarly a general agency called Church and Society, which has a long Methodist history. In the early 20th century, early 1900s, the then Methodist Episcopal Church released what was called the list of social principles, calling for things like fair wages, calling for things like stopping child labor that was dangerous and exploiting children, and really was a focus on how do we as Christians interact with what we see going on in the world around us. So that's the Board of Church and Society. How do we interact with our faith and society? And so as a general agency, there's the Methodist building in Washington, D.C. that is right next to, kind of catty corner to the Supreme Court. And they have a role to advocate on behalf of the United Methodist Church. So as the United Methodist Church, the body that kind of speaks to, I told you this was a can of worms, Kelsey. But as the United Methodist Church, we're not doctrinal in the sense that we have like a catechism like the Catholic Church. We don't have like a list of things you have to believe in order to be United Methodist, but we do have sort of the standard of things like the Wesleyan Quadrilateral and like social action that are just part of our heritage. And so the General Conference is the body that speaks on behalf of the United Methodist Church. So when they pass resolutions similar to the way we do here in East Ohio, those are statements that are on behalf of you as local United Methodists and United Methodists from across the globe. So those statements that the United Methodist Church make often have implications to how we think our policies and politics should be done. And so the United Methodist Church has a stance, against racism, against the over-policing of communities of color. Those are things that the United Methodist Church already stands for. That doesn't mean you have to 100% agree with what those resolutions say in order to be United Methodist, One of the phrases of Methodism is like agree to disagree. We talk about kind of this big tent. So, how do we operate in that space of how we learn from one another, how we're in dialogue. And so anyway, that's at the general church level, and we have that here in East Ohio as well. So we have an East Ohio Board of Church and Society, and I relate to that committee. So those are kind of the two major things I do: racial and social justice. But we also have, as we do that work in the conference in local church areas, that is bound across ecumenical lines. So we have an office that specifically is there to have those ecumenical partnerships and relationships. Those also exist kind of at, I would say, almost a business-like level. We have agreements, they're called shared communion agreements with like the Episcopal Church. We're in dialogues with what that looks like. We have a communion agreement with the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America that basically says, we are so similar in the way that we're doing ministry that it's like we are in full communion, that we your pastors can give communion to our parishioners, our pastors can perform communion for your parishioners. But what it really means is, how do we work at a local level? So, I'm in Akron, but say Minnesota, how are clergy in Minnesota working across belief lines? How are United Methodist pastors working with Presbyterian or Catholic, or how are those things happening, and where can we as Christians kind of present a front on this is what God is calling our nation, our country, our cities to do. And so I get to do that work here in East Ohio. And I'll stop there. But we also have a Native American Awareness Committee and an Ethnic Local Church Concerns Committee, which we have, historically Black United Methodist churches. We have Korean United Methodist churches. There's Hispanic United Methodist churches. We don't have any that exist right here in East Ohio at the moment, but we do have a Hispanic ministry. And so that's an area I focus on as well, working specifically with those expressions of United Methodism.
Cool. Thanks, Will.
I think I covered it all. That's a lot.
Well, and it's cool to know that the church we're a part of does so many things that we may not even realize, are happening. And our church has really been on the forefront of some really important conversations and action steps. Will, how many years did you attend CYF?
That was so long ago now. I think I attended 2 years, but maybe just one. I think I may have been somewhat of a guest at one because my dad was a guest preacher 1 year, so I think I just visited with him. But I definitely attended 1 year.
You led our worship 1 year, didn't you, up at Lakeside?
That could also be what I'm thinking too, is I may have, as a college student, came back and led worship. That's so long ago, Tim.
We're old.
I have video of it, so
Gotcha. So I want to kind of open this up to see like where we're all coming from this morning, students especially, but staff can feel free to jump in too. I mean, so as a person of faith, it's pretty hard to ignore what we've seen going on, the killing of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, so many other names even in the last week that we've seen, and then we've seen protests and rallies and riots. I know yesterday, I think it was David who was talking about some of the things that were going on in Akron. So I'm just curious kind of what you guys have been seeing, what's happening in your local communities, what you think about this, anyways, somebody jump in and tell us kind of your take on what's happening.
In our little town of Carrollton, a couple weeks ago, we had a peaceful protest on the square that my family wasn't a part of or anything because we were getting back from being out with my grandma. But as far as I know, there wasn't any issue with police or anything like that with relations for that. But I have a pretty, I would say, involved look at what's going on because I have to report on the news every day. And it's really, really upsetting to see, like you said, another name almost every day or every week, or another city that's broken out into these riots and protests. And I'm uncomfortable with taking a stance or making my voice be heard because of the possibility of offending or upsetting somebody on either side of anything. And that's where I'm really, really uneasy about speaking my voice and being loud about being a Christian and, upholding these beliefs that we have, is because I don't want to say the wrong thing and get tagged as somebody who is being hateful or offensive,
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that one. And I think you probably do have a unique look on this because you're having to report it from a, as unbiased as possible perspective. Interesting. How about somebody else in another community, or what have you seen going on? David, could you share again your experience for those who weren't on the call yesterday?
Yeah, absolutely. So, in major cities, it's bound to be a little bit different than a smaller community like Carrollton. I remember just the first couple of days. Since then, it's really died down, but there's still stuff going on to this day. Like if I drove downtown, I'm sure I'd see something. But there was I worked downtown in an office building, and I had to be escorted out by police officers of the parking deck that we were staying at, because they're all down Main Street. They were breaking windows. They were just yelling and screaming. The police used tear gas. It was all sorts of bad the first couple of days. Yeah, since then it's really calmed down, but I think we're one of the cities that it continues to there continues to be protest in. And a lot of other communities, you see, it's died down. There's not as much news coverage, but I don't know if people have heard, but there was a young Black girl just graduated high school that was shot in Akron. And so that kind of reignited a lot of stuff that was happening. And there was just protests about that. There was injustice about that. And they actually, on the corner where she got shot in that intersection, they had it closed off for the past week or so. And they painted Black Lives Matter, and they got local artists to come out and make it look cool and stuff like that. I'm sure there's an aerial shot somewhere on social media, but it was really cool to see stuff like that.
That was Nakia, right?
Yes. Yep.
So it sounds like, David, your personal impression of that, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but that you thought that the Black Lives Matter statement on the street was a positive thing for the community.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I don't want to go too into my opinion on certain things, but yeah, I liked seeing the fact that something like that brought our community together, because Akron is a very diverse place. There are concentrated white communities. There's concentrated Black communities. The north side is primarily Nepali refugees. So there's all sorts of ethnic differences in Akron, and seeing one collective thing going on that street. I drove by, and there were people of color and white people just drawing and having a good time and laughing and protesting. It just was nice to see our community come together over something like that.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that. I appreciate it.
Absolutely.
How about somebody else in another community? What have you been seeing or hearing about? Has Wadsworth had much of anything, Micah?
So right as everything started, what was it, the end of May, couple people started a peaceful protest. And I was actually surprised at some of the people organizing it, because some of these kids, they kind of had the idea that they were more like against all of this stuff, and like in the past, like it's just people you wouldn't expect to be part of this. But I guess that maybe makes a point that like this is just a huge eye-opening thing. We had a peaceful protest downtown. It went mostly well. I went to a couple of them, and I also covered it for our newspaper.
Cool.
Got pictures and stuff. I know at one point they like went over to the police station, but like that's the most they did. They were just like chanting with signs and then cheering whenever people honked and stuff. Of course, there would be the occasional person who would like flick them off or something, or someone would come by and start shouting, shouting racial slurs and stuff, and that was bound to happen. I mean, there were a couple police officers who were like at the ready, kind of like around the area. So just in case anything were to escalate, like on both ends, then they would be ready to spring into action. And actually, one of the nights I was there, there was a cop car who drove by and they like honked at us like to show support. Then like 10 minutes later, they actually came by out of their car and they said, we felt like honking wasn't enough. We actually want to come talk to you guys. And they came over and talked to us about how they like what we're doing, how they appreciate us, and how they like that we're making our voices heard. And we had a really good discussion about things, and showing that like police officers, at least in Wadsworth, were being pretty cool about things too.
Tell us kind of how you are. I have to mute your mom, sorry. Go ahead. Was it mostly young people, Micah?
Yeah, it was mostly like high schoolers, maybe a couple college students. There's probably no one there older than like their mid-20s. A lot of people I knew.
On us.
Yeah, there were a couple high school kids. A lot of alumni came back. But yeah, it was a really cool experience. I enjoyed being part of it, and glad we got to make our voices heard.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I was going to say, here in Lorain, we are a very diverse community, about 1/3 white, 1/3 Black, and 1/3 Puerto Rican. And the first day of our protests, I found it interesting that the organizers here had worked alongside the police department. And so the chief of police was actually the first person who spoke, and his words, condemned the actions of the police who murdered George Floyd. And the police walked alongside the protesters here, which I think sent a pretty powerful statement to this community. So that was my experience. Anybody else want to share in your town or community? How about Columbus people?
Sorry, the computer's trying to update. Just as soon as I hit the mic, it tries to update. No, I was going to say similar to Lorraine and Akron, it sounds like, at least in part. At first, the response by officials to the protesting was what we've seen in the past. It was things, you take an aggressive stance and things escalate, and then it gets ugly fast. But then after the mayor sat down with the chief of police and probably gave him a very one-way conversation about it, the response changed. And it was a couple of the videos that I've seen in news stories. You can actually look them up on like 10tv.com on their website. That's the CBS affiliate here. One of them was a couple days after things got ugly and they started to calm down a little bit, and they changed their tactics. Some protesters in Capitol Square, as part of their demonstration, kneeled down to show solidarity. And the reaction of the police and other law enforcement was surprising and in its empathy, because they kneeled down too at the same moment. And you could see an immediate change in everybody's attitude. You had protesters and police embracing each other suddenly, who were once adversaries, now suddenly they're on the same page together. And at least in some measure, they may totally come at this issue from very different angles, but suddenly there was this breaking of the tension that these are people that are starting to see each other as fellow humans, people with faces, with stories, with families and stuff. And it was just captured. Somebody posted a video on it that's been published several times on different news sites. I encourage you to look it up because it's beautiful. It's a moment when people with very different ideologies, very different views, apparently start to see each other for who they are.
Yeah.
And maybe that doesn't mean they necessarily agree on everything, but they're starting to come together. And then only a couple of days later, there was another story, same news source, where there's a small group of my brothers and sisters in faith who happen to be of color out in front of the State House praying. And the lady that they interviewed said that a police cruiser comes up and she's like, "Oh, great," and expecting the worst. And what does he do? He comes up, a white police officer comes up to her and asks, would they pray with him? Because he saw them praying or whatever. And it's in moments like that that I'm like, man, the church has a great opportunity to be on the front of that in our communities, and saying, whether you agree with every tiny little detail of what your neighbor thinks, can we not all start to see each other as fellow human beings, people made in God's image, whom he loves and for whom Christ died? And for heaven's sakes, not throw gas on the fire. That's, if I could say one thing that drives me crazy about our tendency in this country, is to throw gas on the fire instead of coming together and seeing each other as fellow humans. We want to stoke up more and more division, and that's as political as I'm going to get.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's what I want to move toward in this conversation is, what should be our response as Christians, particularly as young people of faith who really have been at the center of this movement, and in every movement in our country, it's been young people. But I first want to take just one step back, and I'm wondering if anyone would be willing to share. We come from some different communities. I think we have Cardington, Carrollton as some of our most rural communities, up to, Akron, Lorain, Columbus. How do you see, if you're willing to share, what does racism look like in your community? And this could be different for all of us, but how have you seen racism at work, maybe in your workplace, in your community, in your home, in your church? Is anyone willing to talk to us a little bit about that?
I think for the majority of people, and I hate to speak on behalf of Carrollton or anything, but from what I've noticed, maybe at school or just in passing store or anything like that, there's not too terribly much that's very outspoken and vocal and like obviously outright offensive. But there are some instances where you can tell with how some people are interacting with people at the store, store workers, older folks who are around. There's a little more hesitation, maybe some reservedness when they're dealing with people of color versus not. And I think that for the most part, with what I understand or know from the police force and anything in town, I don't think that there is too much like butting heads or anything. From what I know, from the protest that we had on our square, there wasn't much conflict between the two. Just there was an issue with how some of the cars were parked, but that was the only thing. There was some good teamwork, I would say, in alliance here for the peaceful protest that went down there. Nice working together and such there. And I think Alliance versus Carrollton, especially having Mount Union here. Mount Union is a very, very diverse campus and very outspoken about being proud of that diversity. And I feel lucky to be able to come to a school from such a small rural town. It's still a pretty small community. It's still local, but I think having that small campus with such a diverse group of students and staff has really opened my eyes to some of the issues like in Carrollton or a small town that, you know, just because they're silent or not as obvious doesn't make them okay or admissible. And I think that that's one thing that's helped my views, at least.
I'm thankful to hear that that's your experience at Mount, because when I was there, I'm a 2010 grad. The people of color who are on campus were there because they were recruited to play sports. So we really saw some racial tension and division surrounding that. So how about other people?
Well, I can speak from a few different communities because I've moved around a lot. I told my students just recently that like one of the things that I was ashamed of is that I very strategically placed myself in churches and under leadership that were very white communities. And that wasn't on accident. I grew up in Louisville, which I think that maybe Micah and Tim can speak to. I don't think that there's an outspoken racism in Louisville, but I think it's a culture of racism that's set by a good portion of the town. I think that the town is even known for being racist. And I know of the few Black students who I grew up with in school, all of the issues and stuff that we had. Even in my graduating class, we had a student whose tires were slashed and who felt himself that he was being followed at a park while he was just walking with his mother. But for me, it was easier growing up to avoid it because even my family was part of it. And if you look back in my family tree and stuff like that, you see a lot of racism. And so for me, I intentionally avoided it because it was easier than addressing it. And then
we have a name for that, right, Connor? That's called white privilege. Yeah. Which we have
and
done.
now in this time, this starts happening and we start seeing, and I'll own too, when Colin Kaepernick kneels, I rolled my eyes. So I understand what's going on. I understand what they're saying because I was part of the problem. For sure, without question, I was part of the problem. And so now seeing all this happening and starting to actually become conscious of it and having to focus on it and looking at what God tells me to do about it, I've had to address it. So in the communities that I've lived in, I've participated in a few different of the protests. I poked my head into Louisville. Louisville was very interesting. They had the police support, but I think that there was one Black person present, and that's because it's Louisville. And I think that the town has done a pretty good job of isolating and in keeping people of color away. In Medina, we had a really good protest that the police were very involved in. The mayor actually attends our church in Medina, and he's a very good guy. And he organized the protest himself and scheduled them himself to include a protest at 4:00 that day of one of the three that included pastors and was centered around the pastors of the community. And that I think went really well and was really well received. So that was good. And I was also part of the Canton protests, which did not go so well. And that was a very kind of like what Eric was saying about how at first that they just didn't know how to respond and they responded with aggression. So I was just right up the street from where they were popping tear gas and trying to disperse the crowds. So that was really difficult to see that that's how this was being handled.
Yeah.
So I think in this area alone, in just East Ohio and even mostly Stark County, I think you see there's very different responses to this. And I completely agree with what Olin was saying in these smaller communities and stuff, and what David was saying. There's a huge difference in what's happening in these smaller communities where you see some of these peaceful protests and stuff like that of very small crowds. And then you see the bigger communities that are actually very segregated even. And you see very different responses to these kind of things in Columbus, in Canton, and Akron. So yeah, it's been really interesting kind of bouncing around and seeing where all this is happening in different areas.
Yeah. Thank you, Connor, for sharing. Anybody else?
Yeah, I think I'd definitely like to piggyback off of some of that. Yeah, I definitely see like the stuff that he said about Louisville. It even exists in certain communities in Akron. Like it's not as much as it used to be. But like you look back 10 years from that like back Ellet's community it's like, I mean, it still is 93% white. Like that was a big thing. And you don't really see that in like the actual high school population. Sorry. We get a lot of people that like transfer in or like get in trouble at other schools and have to go to a different school. And we're like 50-50 in the actual high school community, but in the community as a whole, it's 93% white. And then you go to a place like some parts in West Akron and the Bookdale High School community, their high school demographic is there's maybe one or two white people in the high school, and it's a 97% black school. So seeing that divide a lot, just location wise, even within Akron, is insane. And I know that there is some disdain that goes along with that. I myself have grown up in where my family has been. There's been some racial things that have been said that like I've even noticed, and obviously I don't condone any of that action, but and I think that I've done a good job at kind of forming my own opinions based on what I've experienced in my own life. But there's a lot of circumstances where the grandpa believes something and then it gets passed down generation to generation, never goes away. And that still exists today. I mean, there's people that I graduated from high school that I know that have said some pretty hateful things. But then on the other spectrum, there's people that I know that are completely for this and go to protests and go to rallies. And my first 3 years of high school, I went to a school called Akron Early College High School. And I didn't actually go to Ellet. I only went there my senior year. And what they do is they take around 100 people from the city of Akron, and you have to apply. They do it based on a lot of stuff, but the demographic there, I think, helped me so much learn about other races, because I was put into a school where it was all sorts of different people, all from around Akron. There were people that were refugee. There we had a refugee from Syria. You had all the Nepali refugees from the North Akron community. You had the people from the Black community in terms of like the Kenmore area, the Firestone Park area, West Akron, and then you had like the white areas like Fairlawn and Ellet and stuff like that. So it was my high school years really like opened my eyes to a lot of different things. But for some people that wasn't the case. Like
Right.
people that isolated area like Carrollton or an isolated area like Louisville, where they only get that one perspective and they don't get to see the rest of the world.
Right. And I think that's important. I grew up in a predominantly white area. I have served predominantly white churches, and I think there's a lot of truth in what you're saying, David, but I also think, like you're saying, even if we grew up in small communities and we were really only around people who looked like us, now is the time that we have to start opening our eyes and listening
Absolutely.
to the voices of people of color. One of the things I'm learning in my own experience, I'm a helper personality. I want to fix things. And so sitting and listening to some of my Black brothers and sisters share their pain is hard, but we have to do it. We have to listen to their voices and understand that their experience has been different from ours. And so I think protests are a good start, and I'm so thankful for the young people who have been leading this movement. You all give me hope that your generation will actually make some change. And I want to throw it back to Will for a minute to talk about protests. In my opinion, are the first step of this movement. But if you look around most of your Methodist churches, you're still going to see mostly white people. If you look around CYF, you're still going to see mostly white people. What are the kind of changes, Will, that you would say need to take place in our own hearts, in our churches, in our communities, that will kind of keep us moving in the direction that God is calling us?
Oh gosh. Thanks first of all for everyone who shared, and just really great to hear your experiences and how this is impacting you all, and the different ways you've experienced this for yourselves. I think that's really important to take time to reflect on your feelings. You know, where am I at? Where are my beliefs? Why do I believe the things I believe? That's so important, and I think a really important aspect of our faith too, and discipleship, especially as Methodists. So kind of to respond to your question, Kelsey, I think first and foremost, this is a discipleship issue. And as we try and live into emulating who Jesus Christ was, we can look at the stories in Scripture, the Good Samaritan, the woman at the well, the Syrophoenician woman, all these examples of how Jesus interacted with people that were people that were in a different social status than he was, and how he responded. And that gives us at least a starting point for how we ought to respond. And I use ought because there's a moral imperative there, that if we're to be more Christ-like, we really ought to be following in his footsteps and how he treated others, period. And it always, from my perspective, starts from a place of empathy and compassion, not of judgment. And so that's a way that a Christian can respond to kind of seeing the protests. And, as people are asking about rioting, I've used the Martin Luther King quote about it being the language of the oppressed. But if we're taking it from a Christian perspective, we really got to start with a place of empathy, and trying to put ourselves in the other person's shoes. And, that self-reflection piece comes in, and my squares have kind of been moving around, so I forget exactly who shared, maybe Connor, about when you see someone kneel during the national anthem, you have this visceral reaction, you have this sort of automatic response. And I think part of our Christian journey is learning how to capture every thought, and to suspend our judgments, suspend the things that we want to humanly do in response, or humanly think or say, and to suspend that judgment, capture that thought, and then reflect on what would Jesus do, right? And it's so interesting being on social media during this time, because my general, usually I'm like, man, Facebook is a dumpster fire today. Then the next day I'm like, man, Facebook's a dumpster fire today. You see a lot of that reaction, that you see a lot of people trying to signal kind of where they're at, and not a lot of suspended judgment, not a lot of nuance, not a lot of trying to empathize or to learn about, or to put yourself in someone else's shoes. And that's a part of our faith journey. I think that's a part of growing into what it means to be a mature Christian. And as I went through high school, and as you go through life, you come to these different experiences. Maybe you're on a mission trip. Maybe you're in a job, or you're working with someone else. You're in a class with someone else from a different part of the world. Those opportunities are learning opportunities for us to try and see what it's like to be someone, to be in relationship with someone who's different than you. And so it really is part of the discipleship journey. I think there's some foundational theological truths that if we, if we really believe that everyone is created in the image of God, then it's sort of asking, how should that result? How should that play out, right? How, if we really truly believe that everyone's created in the image of God, why do we see disparities in our society? So, I think there's some wrestling that we just have to do as Christians to see, what do we actually believe? Do we believe what we say we believe? And do we practice that? So that's kind of from a faith perspective. The kind of what we can do with that, that's a lot of good, maybe accountability, Bible study stuff, but that's not going to necessarily fix the problems we have. And so there is a part of this that moves us to action. And the closer you get to these things, whether it's through relationships or your own learning, it's really the move of the Spirit that gets you feel compelled to do something. And in our Methodist Wesleyan tradition, we call that acts of mercy. So when you're compelled to do something, maybe you're compelled to volunteer at a soup kitchen. That's a personal act of mercy. You feel that God's calling you to participate in addressing a hunger somehow, and so you volunteer by sorting groceries or working at a soup kitchen or giving out food. That's a personal act of mercy. But then as you continue to grow in that area, you come to a place where you realize, boy, there's a whole system that's creating communities that are impoverished, that are facing hunger on a daily basis. And how do I respond to that as a Christian? And that's a communal act of mercy. And that's really the call of our church, our collective voices to come together to say, how can we change the injustices in the world? When you kind of asked how do we see racism play out today, and I immediately thought of, and my background's in urban planning, and you can see it in the landscape of cities. You can see it in how cities were formed. You can see areas of high concentrated poverty that have more presence, more interactions with the police. So as you learn about those things, as you learn about history and how we kind of got to where we're at today, that's how I see racism still present. That white flight took place, not that long ago. That as people of color were able to purchase homes, you saw migration of cities kind of out to Wadsworth and Ellett and areas surrounding Akron, and that leaves kind of a hole in Akron in terms of their ability to provide good schools because there's less of a tax base. So the way I see racism today, I reached over, I grabbed this book, Evicted. It's looking at things like how are we treating the most vulnerable in our societies? What do the eviction courts look like? Are we moving around single mothers and their children from place to place? And are as we're doing those things, is a higher portion of those folks Black? And you mentioned, you guys were talking about the two pandemics, and a lot of Columbus and other cities now have declared racism a health emergency. And the reason for that is because there are actual disparities that come out of the systems that we've created for people. And so we know that people of color have higher rates of diabetes. Children in cities, young Black boys have higher rates of asthma, right? And why are those things? Why do those things exist? And you can point to very real policy decisions that created those environments, that created that system. So that's how I see racism as it plays out today. And that's in addition to the personal racism that people of color feel, racial slurs, being profiled, And so there's all this combined weight of these pressures, right? It to me is why there's such this anger that the country's seeing on display right now.
Hey, Will, could I jump in and ask you, so some of us may have some extra time right now in quarantine, and are there, so I'm going to give this question to Will first and then to students if you've got things to share. Are there particular voices? One of the things growing up white for me is most of the TV shows I watched had white characters. Most of the books I read had white characters. And now one of the things I'm trying to do is make sure that I'm reading and watching, listening to the voices of people of color. So are there people that you would point us to, voices that as young people we should be watching out for right now, listening to, learning from?
Brian Stevenson is probably one of the top people I would recommend just for personal learning. If that's what you're getting after, really. He wrote Just Mercy. There's a movie. It's free during the month of June that is based on a true story of some of the work he started doing in Alabama with death row inmates. But that's a very real and very modern system that indiscriminately kills Black men at a higher rate than others. So, and the United Methodist Church has a very strong stance against the death penalty, and so that's a good place to start. And then you can grow from there. Why are Black men convicted at higher rates, and why are their sentences more punishment oriented, longer, and what's that mean for the way we're treating, again, the most vulnerable in society? And he has a quote that kind of gets at that, and that our character is really revealed in how we treat the most vulnerable members of our society. It's not how we treat the wealthy,
Right.
but in the way we just operate in the world, we treat the wealthy very well. And so what's that say about how we're trying to live like Jesus? So that would be where I would start for folks.
So Just Mercy is the movie. It's also a book, but it's free on Netflix this month. Anybody else just throw out the name of a resource, something you've read or watched recently that might help other people?
A couple of things that are on Netflix is there's a documentary called 13th, which is about the 13th Amendment, which basically is about, it kind of goes along with the mass incarceration and post-slavery, but help me out, Will. The legalization of sort of incarcerating basically ex-slaves and whatnot. It kind of walks you through the mass incarceration discussion. Sorry, I didn't articulate that very well. Another, I think it's a Netflix series, is called When They See Us. And it's a 5-part series, I believe, about the Central Park Five, who were five African-American young boys who were wrongfully accused of a crime in, I think, the late 80s. Since most students are probably on Netflix, I would watch that. Maybe watch it with some friends so you can talk about it, because there's a lot to digest. And then lastly, I just read the book White Fragility. And I don't know if any young students are interested in reading, but it might help you understand more where perhaps some of your parents or even grandparents or people that you're connected with, where they're coming from, maybe why they get so defensive when issues of race come up. I'll echo, I think Olin said it right at the beginning. It's hard to know how to talk about this. And so I think we're in this learning process, and none of us want to say the wrong things. And that book really helped me. I'm still processing it, but just really helped me see that I am coming from a place of privilege, and how I process that can help me then communicate better and perhaps hopefully be an advocate for people on the margins. So
thank you. What else, students even, are there like social media profiles that we should be following or paying attention to? I know Twitter has been, and hey, TikTok, has really stepped up and started some movements. So students, do you have any people or groups that we should be following as adults to be learning from?
There's a really good podcast out now called Pod Save the People.
Mm-hmm.
And DeRay McKesson is a voice that I would listen to, especially at this time too. But so he has a podcast, and yeah, that's another good one.
Cool.
He has a book out too. I just started reading it, called The Other Side of Freedom.
I think Kelsey's really on a good track here with social media. I think, I dare one of you to raise your hand of the students in here who aren't spending a lot of time on social media. So I found a couple who were really good. And so one of them was, if you listen to any interview that the Bishop T.D. Jakes has done in the past couple weeks, that's a pretty good understanding of just somebody who's been fighting for this for a long time and is tired of it. But for me personally, somebody who was incredibly, incredibly helpful for me is a pastor named Carl Lentz, who's actually a white pastor. And it's been so helpful to me to watch him kind of say, you know what, I haven't stood up for this like I should have. And then he started taking a stance and doing what we should do as Christians. And then he will consistently post comments and stuff that people make trying to silence him. And so he will discuss on his Instagram page, especially, where what people with these racist tendencies are trying to say to him. And it's always trying to change the narrative. It's trying to do something else. It's, pastor, stop focusing on this. It's time to move on. And this is stuff that if you guys go out and you guys want to make a stance and you guys want to use your platforms, that you will face. So it's really good for me, at least, to watch him and see what he's posting. And he's made a stance that he's not going to stop talking about this until serious change starts happening. And he's not going to let this just kind of be the next, movement that lasts a couple weeks and then it's over. He's going to hold on to it. So he's a really good one, I think, to lean into as well.
How long does this go, Kelsey? I'm sorry.
I'm till noon, so I was going to wrap this up.
I was going to take us into a whole wider other different conversation, but that's okay.
I think, this is a thing that cannot be handled in an hour-long conversation. And I really appreciate those of you hanging in for this conversation. And there is a resource I shared on Facebook. It's like the 30-day challenge to become an anti-racist, something like that. And each day it gives you something to listen to or watch or read. And they're all available, easily available. So that might be something if you're trying to look, for example, if you live in a small town and this isn't something that has really affected your life yet, to start learning and listening. Here's what I want to end with today as we go to prayer. Tomorrow night, I forget who is speaking, but they're speaking about hope. Isn't that right? And I just want to send this message to young people who are listening. And say once again that you all are giving me hope. I am so excited to see how the generation below me is taking a hold of true justice issues and beginning to use your voices, not just on social media, but in the streets and even in government and legislation and in our churches, to make a real difference. And so I'm leaving the conversation today with hope that Jesus has this beautiful picture of the kingdom of God that includes people of all races and backgrounds, and it is beautiful. It's a mosaic picture of God's kingdom, and we have been invited to participate in making that kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. And I feel very good about the generation that is being raised up by Christ to help lead this movement. So with that, I want to just close with prayer and ask that God would continue to guide us. So, Lord, thank you so much for the opportunity to be gathered together today in your name. thank you so much for Will for being here today and sharing some of his experience and resources and learning and helping educate us on some of the things we should be paying attention to. Lord, this is not a conversation or a topic that we can handle in an hour, because we're talking about your children. We're talking about our brothers, our sisters, our siblings in Christ, who you have created to be beautiful and to live fulfilling lives. And we know that there are systems and structures that for far too long have created a divide between us, telling us that one person is better than another. But that is not how we've been created. So today we have hope that we are beginning to see change for your kingdom. We have hope that you have shown us how to love in a way that casts out all fear. And we have hope that you will use us to help bring about the change that we need to see in this world. We place our trust and our hope in you as our Lord and as our Savior and as our friend. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Tim or Joe, can someone tell us about tomorrow night and how we log in?
I don't see Tim, and I know that Zach is kind of sort of still attached. The service, the final service for CYF this year is going to be on Wednesday at 8 p.m. exactly the same way that we logged on Sunday night. And Tim is actually the speaker, the primary speaker. There will be other pieces involved. Let me also say, I wanted to echo what Will said earlier from a different perspective, because I think it's valuable to this conversation. One of the resources that we underestimate is the scriptures. But Will was talking about imitating Christ and go there. But what we have to do is change the way we approach the scriptures and recognize that we identify with certain characters. And what I would encourage, especially we who are white, is to read from the perspective of people who are not white, and how often the scriptures bring to the fore the people who are on the margins. I just preached last week on Genesis 16 and how Genesis emphasizes Hagar, who is an Egyptian slave, and how she's brought to the fore. And so we need to read the scriptures from that perspective, like Will was encouraging, of how Jesus sees people on the margins, because we tend to focus and see ourselves as the heroes, and maybe we're not.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. So hopefully we'll see everybody. We can communicate through the chat on YouTube tomorrow night, and we will worship together to kind of conclude our week of CYF together. So thanks, guys, for tuning in today, and we'll see you tomorrow night.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks, Will.